Most of the work in remote park stations is routine. Logs, radios, weather, quiet stretches where nothing happens. But every so often, something small doesn't line up, and it stays that way longer than it should. These are accounts from people who noticed those moments and didn't dismiss them. I was in my third season working a backcountry contact station in the eastern section of Shenandoah National Park, a place that only stayed staffed from late spring into early fall, mostly to manage permits and keep an eye on a handful of remote trailheads that didn't see much traffic. The building itself was a single-room structure with a narrow porch, solar panels that worked when they felt like it, and a radio setup that depended heavily on weather conditions and elevation. So every evening around 6:30 I'd run a check-in with the main ranger office before the valley interference got worse. And that particular week had been uneventful in a way that felt almost exaggerated, like even the usual thru-hikers had thinned out earlier than expected, leaving long, quiet blocks where the only sound was wind pressing through the trees and the occasional creak from the station's metal roof adjusting to temperature drops. The first thing that caught my attention was the sign-in log, which sat on a wooden stand just outside the door under a plexiglass cover, because sometime between my morning check and mid-afternoon, a new entry had appeared in handwriting that didn't match any of the hikers I'd spoken to recently. And what stood out wasn't the name, it was that the entry listed a trail loop that had been closed for over a month due to storm damage further north, a closure I personally updated on the board myself, including stapling a printed notice over the old map section. And I remember standing there a little longer than necessary, flipping back through earlier pages to make sure I hadn't missed something, but the rest of the log looked normal. Dated entries, familiar styles, nothing out of place. So I made a note in my own logbook inside, more out of habit than concern, and figured someone had either ignored the closure sign or written it down wrong. Later that evening, during my radio check, I mentioned it briefly to the main office, and they asked for the name, but reception dipped right as I started spelling it out, and by the time the signal came back, they'd moved on to another unit. So it stayed unresolved, which wasn't unusual for that station, since communication gaps were part of the routine. What made it harder to shake was that just before dusk, while I was doing a walk along the short service road that led to the supply shed, about 100 yards downhill, I noticed tire tracks that hadn't been there that morning, shallow, but fresh enough to still hold the shape of the tread. And they stopped just short of the turnaround area, as if the vehicle had backed out rather than continued forward, which didn't make sense because the road was too narrow for anything larger than a small truck. And nobody had checked in about vehicle access that day, and I would have heard an engine from that distance in the quiet we'd had. I followed the tracks a bit with my flashlight as the light started dropping, noticing they overlapped slightly with older impressions but cut sharper edges into the dust. And there were no footprints leading away from them, which I found myself focusing on more than anything, like I expected to see some sign of someone getting out, adjusting gear, something normal, but there was just the road, the tracks, and the tree line sitting still around it. I headed back up before it got fully dark, closed up the station, and made another note, adding the detail about the tracks. And that night the radio didn't cooperate at all, just static and occasional broken syllables, so I couldn't follow up. And without a working connection, the protocol was basically to stay put unless there was a clear emergency, which there wasn't, just small inconsistencies stacking quietly. Sometime after midnight I woke up without knowing why, the kind of wake up where everything is already still and your brain is trying to figure out what changed. And at first I thought it was the generator cycling off, but that had been shut down hours earlier. And then I noticed a faint intermittent light moving across the inside wall opposite the window, not steady like a beam, more like it was being blocked and unblocked as it shifted. And I sat there for a while watching it, letting my eyes adjust, until I realized the source had to be outside, on the far side of the station where the trailhead board was, because of the angle it was coming through the glass. And that didn't line up with anything that should have been happening at that hour, especially with no scheduled overnight hikers on record. I didn't rush outside, which I think was the right call looking back. I just moved quietly to the radio table and tried again to get a signal, but all I got was a low hum. So I switched off the interior light instead and waited. And after maybe a minute, the moving light stopped entirely. Not faded, just stopped. Like whoever was holding it had lowered it or turned it off at once. And the silence after that felt heavier than the noise had. Enough that I became aware of small things like the way the floorboard near the door expanded slightly when the temperature dropped. Making a soft click I'd heard 100 times before, but now seemed louder. I stayed awake the rest of the night without stepping outside, and when morning came, I went straight to the sign-in board before anything else. And the new entry from the previous day was gone. Not crossed out or smeared, just gone, as if that page had never held it. Except the indentation from the pin was still there when I angled it in the light. Faint, but readable, if you knew where to look. And the closure notice I'd stapled over the map had been carefully lifted on one corner and set back down slightly off alignment. Not enough to notice unless you remembered exactly how it had sat before, which I did, because I pressed it flat myself with the side of my hand. And I remember standing there with the logbook in my grip, trying to decide whether this was something to escalate, or just another one of those things that wouldn't translate well over a broken radio. And when I finally got through to the main office later that morning, they told me no vehicles had been authorized in that sector overnight, and no other stations had reported activity. And the name I gave them didn't match any permits in the system. What I didn't include in that report, and what stayed with me after I transferred out at the end of the season, was that when I went back to the service road one last time before leaving, the tire tracks I'd seen were still there, untouched by weather, and running alongside them for about 20 feet. Just at the edge where the dust met the grass, there was a second set of impressions I hadn't noticed before, not clear enough to call footprints. More like repeated shallow shifts in the same spots, as if someone had been standing there for a long time without moving very far at all. I took a temporary late-season assignment in the northern sector of Bridger-Teton National Forest after the usual staff rotation left a gap, and because I'd spent most of my career in lower elevation desert units. I was still getting used to how quickly the light dropped behind the ridgelines, and how radio coverage came and went depending on which side of a slope you were standing on. The station itself wasn't much more than a reinforced cabin used for trail maintenance coordination, with a separate storage shed for tools and a metal board out front where backcountry users could clip their permits if they passed through. Though by October there weren't many, and the main thing I was responsible for was checking a network of lesser-used trails for storm damage before snowfall made access impossible, which meant long solo hikes and a lot of time checking and rechecking the same quiet terrain. The first irregular thing wasn't visual. It was a voice on the radio, just after noon during a scheduled check. Not coming through dispatch, but on the same frequency, asking if Unit 3 was still active in the basin. And the phrasing was off, because we didn't use that designation out there. And when I responded with my call sign and asked them to identify, there was a pause, long enough that I thought the signal had dropped, before they came back with something that sounded like a name, but it cut out halfway through and didn't repeat, and I didn't think much of it beyond noting interference, since overlapping frequencies weren't unheard of in that terrain. That afternoon I hiked out along a side trail that followed a shallow creek, mostly to check a footbridge that had been flagged in a previous report, and while the bridge itself was fine, I found a campsite about 50 yards upstream that wasn't marked or permitted. Set back into the trees where it wouldn't be visible from the trail, and it looked recently used but not in the usual way. No fire ring, no obvious cooking setup. Just a tarp strung low between two trees, and a couple of plastic water jugs tucked into the brush, which I remember thinking was odd for that time of year because anyone camping that minimally in October usually moved through fast. Not set up like they planned to stay. I logged the location on my map and headed back before the temperature dropped further. And when I got within sight of the station, I noticed the permit board had one new tag clipped to it. A handwritten slip that listed a 2-day stay on a trail that didn't connect directly to where I'd just been. And the name on it was written in block letters that looked almost deliberate, like someone trying not to show their normal handwriting, which stuck with me more than it should have. That evening, during the next radio window, I mentioned both the unknown campsite and the earlier transmission, and dispatch said they hadn't logged any off-frequency units in that area. But before they could say more, the line filled with static again, the kind that builds slowly and then cuts everything out, leaving you with that empty hiss that makes you keep adjusting the dial even though you know it won't fix it. It got colder faster than I expected that night, enough that I had to run the small propane heater inside the cabin. And sometime around 9 I heard what I first thought was a branch falling near the shed, a short solid sound followed by a lighter scrape. But when I stepped out with a flashlight, the ground was clear, except for a narrow track in the thin frost that ran parallel to the side of the building, not directly toward it, more like something or someone had walked along the perimeter without approaching the door. And I followed it a few steps until it disappeared into a patch of harder ground where the frost hadn't settled as evenly. I didn't sleep much after that, and just before dawn, while I was making coffee on the small stove, the radio clicked on by itself. Not a full transmission, just that initial burst of sound like someone keying in, followed by a fragment of speech that I recognized immediately as my own voice from earlier in the day, repeating the part where I'd given my call sign, but slightly distorted, as if it had been recorded and played back through a different device, and then it cut off again. I shut the radio down completely after that and waited for daylight, and once it was fully light, I went straight to the shed to check the lock, which was still secured. But the dust along the base of the door had been disturbed in a way that suggested something had been set down and lifted again. Not heavy, just enough to leave a faint outline that didn't match any of the tools we kept there. Later that morning, I hiked back out to the unmarked campsite to document it more thoroughly, and when I reached the spot, the tarp was gone, the jugs were gone, even the flattened area where someone had been sleeping had been brushed out with something, leaving the ground looking artificially even compared to the surrounding forest floor, and the only thing left was a short length of cut rope hanging from one of the trees, tied in a simple knot at about shoulder height. Positioned in a way that faced directly toward the trail rather than into the campsite itself, I reported everything once I got a clear radio window again, and a team was scheduled to come up the following day. But by the time they arrived, fresh snow had moved in overnight, covering most of the smaller details, and the official conclusion leaned toward unauthorized campers moving through and possibly scanning frequencies with a handheld radio, which technically fit. But it didn't explain why. The only transmission I heard repeated back to me had been my own voice, or why, when I checked the permit board before they left. The handwritten tag from the night before was still there, but now listed a third day added at the bottom in a different pen, even though no one had approached the station while I was there. The assignment came through late because the usual winter caretaker backed out, so I ended up spending 6 weeks alone at a maintenance outpost on the South Rim sector of Great Basin National Park, a place that sits higher than people expect and gets quiet in a way that feels stretched thin, like sound doesn't carry properly once the snow settles into the trees. My job wasn't glamorous: keep the generator running in intervals, monitor weather instruments, and make sure the access road stayed passable enough for emergency vehicles. But the isolation was the real factor, because once storms rolled through, you could go days without seeing another person or getting a clean radio connection back to headquarters. I was in my early 40s then, not new to remote work, but this was the first time I'd been somewhere where the nearest staff station was over an hour away, even in good conditions, and that distance started to matter more after the third day, when I noticed the access gate at the lower bend had been left open, something I was certain I'd locked myself after doing a fuel run earlier that week, and at first I figured wind had rattled it loose, or I'd been careless. But the chain hadn't just slipped, it had been unwound and hooked back in a different way, higher up on the post, like someone taller had done it without thinking about the usual loop. I closed it properly and made a note in my log, then drove back up, checking the road as I went, noticing fresh compression in the snow along the tire paths that didn't match my truck's spacing, slightly narrower, which suggested a different vehicle had come through recently, though I hadn't heard an engine, and there weren't any scheduled visits. That afternoon the weather shifted quickly. wind picking up from the west and pushing low clouds across the ridge. And by evening the visibility dropped enough that the trees beyond the immediate clearing blurred into a flat gray. So I focused on indoor tasks, logging instrument readings and checking the radio, which came through in short bursts. Enough to confirm nothing urgent, but not enough for a full conversation. Sometime after dark, while I was in the storage room behind the main cabin, I heard a dull metallic knock from outside. Not loud. Just a single contact sound, like something tapping the exterior wall near the fuel tank, and I stood there for a moment listening for a follow-up that didn't come. So I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, catching the edges of the snowbanks, the parked truck, the line of trees. Nothing moving, nothing obviously disturbed. But when I angled the light toward the fuel tank, I saw that the small access panel on its side was hanging slightly open, which I knew I had secured earlier because it had a tendency to freeze shut if left ajar. I closed it again and checked the latch, then circled the cabin once, noticing along the back wall a series of shallow impressions in the snow that ran parallel to the structure. Not quite footprints, more like partial placements where weight had shifted but not fully pressed down, spaced inconsistently, as if whoever made them had been moving slowly or stopping often. I didn't follow them far, because the wind was picking up and visibility was getting worse, and at that point, I still leaned toward assuming it was someone who had come up the access road without checking in, maybe looking for shelter. Though it didn't sit right that they hadn't approached the door or tried to make contact. The next morning, the storm had passed, but left a clean layer of new snow over everything, which usually resets the landscape in a helpful way. But in this case, it also erased whatever tracks I might have used to figure out what had been there the night before. And as I went through my routine, clearing the steps, checking the generator housing, I noticed the antenna line that ran from the roof to a support post had been repositioned slightly, not disconnected, just angled differently, like it had been lifted and set back down. And I couldn't come up with a practical reason for that happening on its own. Later, during a brief window of radio clarity, I reported the open grass gate, the second set of tire tracks, and the disturbances around the cabin, and the response I got was measured, not dismissive but not urgent either. Essentially advising me to document everything and avoid leaving the station unnecessarily until conditions improved. By the fourth day, the sense that something had been moving through the area without announcing itself had settled in enough that I started checking small things more carefully, like the position of tools on the workbench and the level of fuel in the backup canisters. And that's when I realized one of the red 5-gallon cans in the shed was lighter than it should have been. Not empty, but used. And I had a habit of marking the caps with a grease pencil line after filling them, which this one no longer had. That same afternoon, while I was updating the paper log near the radio console, a transmission came through clear enough to make out words, not from dispatch but on the same frequency. A voice asking for road conditions at the upper station, which was close to what we called this place, but not exact. And when I responded, the voice didn't answer directly, just repeated the question with slightly different wording, as if reading from a note, and then went quiet again. I kept the radio on after that, volume low, and just before dusk, while the sky shifted from gray to that dull blue you get before full dark in snow country, I saw movement near the lower edge of the clearing. Not a person fully visible, just a change in the way the tree line held its shape. And when I brought the binoculars up, I caught a brief outline of something vertical slipping behind a trunk. Too controlled to be an animal, too deliberate in how it stopped and stayed still once it was partially concealed. I didn't go down there. I stayed on the porch longer than I needed to, watching the same spot until the light faded enough that everything flattened again. And then I went inside and secured what I could, checking the door twice. Not out of panic, but out of a growing sense that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself cleanly. The next morning, I decided to drive down to the gate again despite the conditions. Partly to confirm whether the tracks had returned, and partly because I needed a clearer view of the lower road. And when I reached it, the chain was still in place the way I'd left it, but just beyond the bend. Partially hidden by a stand of juniper, there was a vehicle parked off the road, positioned at an angle that kept it out of direct sight from above. An older model SUV, with no visible markings, no license plate on the rear, and a thin layer of snow on the windshield that suggested it hadn't moved since the storm. I approached slowly, calling out once, getting no response, and when I got close enough to look inside, the seats were empty. The back area cleared out except for a folded tarp and a handheld radio unit sitting on the floor, the kind you could program to scan multiple frequencies. And I remember noticing that it was powered on, a small light blinking at steady intervals. I didn't touch it. I stepped back and radioed in what I'd found as clearly as the connection allowed, and then I returned to the station to wait for backup, which didn't arrive until late that afternoon due to road conditions, and by the time they reached the vehicle, it was still there, still empty, still showing no obvious signs of who had driven it up. The official follow-up leaned toward unauthorized access, combined with someone monitoring ranger frequencies, possibly to avoid contact. And they towed the vehicle out, logged the equipment, and swept the area. But they didn't find anyone, and no one came forward to claim it. What stayed with me, and what I didn't fully articulate in my report because it felt too uncertain at the time, was that when I returned to the cabin after they left and went to log the day's events, I found an entry already written in the margin of the previous page, in a handwriting that wasn't mine, listing a fuel level measurement for the generator that was accurate to within a fraction of a gallon, recorded at a timestamp from the night before, during the same window when I'd seen that movement at the edge of the clearing. I wasn't permanent staff when this happened, just a seasonal trail crew lead finishing out a late summer contract in the Canyon District of Big Bend National Park, assigned to a remote contact station near one of the less traveled desert trailheads, where the main job was checking permits, updating water reports, and keeping an eye on a long stretch of backcountry route that cut through dry washes and low ridges before disappearing toward the river. The heat that time of year didn't ease much even after sunset, and the station held it in like a box. So I had a habit of sitting outside after dark with the logbook and a headlamp, listening for late arrivals and writing down anything that needed to go into the morning report. And it was during one of those nights that a vehicle came in later than expected, not unusual by itself, but it approached without headlights until it was nearly at the turnaround, which made it feel like it had been coasting in under the cover of the terrain. When the driver stepped out, he didn't come straight to the station like most people do. He stood by the truck for a moment, looking past me toward the trail signboard instead of at me. And when I asked if he needed a permit, he said he already had one but didn't offer it, just gave a first name and said he'd be out for 2 nights. And something about the way he spoke felt rehearsed, like he was sticking to a simple version of a story and didn't want to add detail. I logged what he gave me and watched him head down the trail with a small pack and a flashlight. He kept angled low, not sweeping ahead the way most hikers do in unfamiliar terrain. And after he disappeared into the dark, I went back to the logbook and realized he hadn't actually filled out a tag for the board, so I wrote a placeholder entry myself, which we were allowed to do in cases where someone bypassed the process. Figuring I'd sort it out in the morning, the next day passed normally. A couple of day hikers, routine checks. Nothing that connected back to the previous night, until late afternoon when I hiked a short section of the trail to inspect a washed-out marker, and found a second campsite set up about half a mile in, tucked behind a low rock formation where it wouldn't be visible from the main path. And this one had more structure than the typical overnight setup. 2 small shade tarps, a cooler partially buried in sand, and a stack of empty water bottles arranged neatly along the base of a rock, not scattered the way they usually end up. And I remember thinking it looked less like someone passing through and more like someone staging supplies for repeated use. I didn't disturb anything, just marked the location and headed back as the light started dropping. And when I returned to the station, the permit board had been adjusted, not vandalized, just shifted. The metal clips moved slightly, so the tags hung at a different angle, and the placeholder entry I'd written the night before was gone. Not torn out, but missing entirely, the space where it had been left blank as if it had never been written. That night I stayed inside instead of sitting on the porch, partly because of the heat and partly because I didn't like the idea of someone moving around that close without making contact. And around 10 I heard a vehicle again, this time stopping farther out on the access road instead of pulling all the way in, the engine cutting off, and then nothing for a long stretch, long enough that I started to think I'd imagined it. Until a faint beam of light appeared briefly through the front window, sweeping low across the ground and then disappearing, like someone checking the layout without approaching. I didn't go out. I kept the interior lights off and listened. And after a while, the engine turned over again and the vehicle left, the sound fading out along the dirt road until it blended into the usual night noise. The following morning, I checked the road and found tire tracks that didn't match the truck from the first night, wider, with a different tread pattern, and they stopped short of the station just like I'd heard, turning around before reaching the clearing. Later, that day, I hiked back to the second campsite to document it more thoroughly before reporting it. And when I got there, the arrangement had changed. Not drastically, but enough that it was obvious. One of the tarps had been lowered closer to the ground, the cooler repositioned, and the line of empty bottles extended farther along the rock. Like someone had added to it or reorganized it with intention. And what stood out most was that the ground between the campsite and the trail had been brushed over in a way that reduced visible footprints. Not perfectly, but enough to break up clear patterns. I reported everything that evening once I got a clean radio window, including the vehicles and the campsite, and was told a ranger unit would check it within the next day or two, depending on availability, which was standard for that district. But before anyone could arrive, a storm system moved through overnight. Not heavy rain, but enough wind to shift sand and blur tracks. And when I went out the next morning, the access road looked cleaner than it should have after recent traffic, like the top layer had been redistributed evenly. The ranger unit came through late that afternoon, and I walked them out to the campsite. But by then, it had been stripped down completely. No tarps, no cooler, no bottles, just a flat stretch of disturbed ground that didn't hold much detail anymore. And the official take was that it had been an unauthorized camp that packed out quickly after realizing they'd been noticed. I finished out my remaining days without further incidents, and the station went back to its usual rhythm. But on my last morning there, while I was clearing out the interior and doing a final check of the storage cabinet where we kept spare forms and basic supplies, I found a folded permit slip tucked behind a stack. Not one I had issued, filled out in the same block lettering I'd seen on the board, listing the same first name the man had given me that first night, but with dates that extended 3 days beyond when I had last been on shift. And under the section where you're supposed to list your planned route, there was only a short line drawn across the space, as if the person filling it out had decided not to write anything at all.